Welcome to episode 2 of the Media Conversations with Maliik Cooper podcast. I'm your host, Maliik Cooper, and joining me today is Alex Zietlow, sports editor of the Rock Hill Herald in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Alex covers the Carolina Panthers, Winthrop men's basketball, and local high school sports, among other things. So welcome to the show, Alex.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, for sure.
And you pronounced my name correctly. Zietlow. I love it. I love it so much.
It's really unique. I've definitely never met anyone with that name before. I'm glad I did it right.
Yeah.
I actually remember it because you came to South Pointe 2 or 3 years ago. Do you remember that? And you were trying to give our class insight on what it meant to be like a professional sports reporter and writer.
Oh, do I remember that? Of course I remember it. I remember being utterly uninspiring to your class. I mean, I tried to be uninspiring. I tried to be relatable, but in instances after that, in talking to young people after that and talking to classes after that, I've refined my points, and I've hopefully been more interesting and made my job sound more compelling than I did that first time I did. I mean, my tagline now as the sports editor of the Herald in Rock Hill is basically, I wake up every day and I talk to the most interesting people that I want to, that I know, and I write stories about them. And I write stories that make people laugh, cry, and think. And those stories ultimately, hopefully, impact the community, unite the community, and just enrich people's lives who read the Herald in a way that, other means of doing so can't as much. Local news is really important to me, and I'm sure I'll go on a whole bunch of tangents about why local journalism is important, but that's ultimately what I do. And ultimately what I wish I could have told your class when I visit them first is, my job is awesome because literally I talk to awesome people and I tell their stories, and in doing so I enrich the community.
Local news is really important. I'm glad we started right there with how you were at my class 2 or 3 years ago, because what I wanted to ask you, one of the first things was how at the time I think you were doing mostly high school football, maybe high school sports in general, but now it seems like Winthrop men's basketball has become such a huge part of what you do. So when did that transition sort of occur, and why?
Well, so it's always been there. It's always kind of been a part of the beat. My predecessor, Brett McCormick, really covered Winthrop basketball really well. So my beat per se, or what I cover as the sports editor, the sports reporter at the Herald, is I cover high school sports, which includes 15 to 17 high schools in York, Chester, and Lancaster counties in South Carolina. And then I also cover Winthrop men's basketball, kind of on a beat basis. In other words, I go to all the home games, I write features, I write game stories-ish, analysis stories-ish. I also cover Winthrop athletic stories at large, like for instance, when the athletic director at Winthrop leaves or a new one gets hired, I write about that. I kind of try to stay up on all Winthrop athletic stuff. And then outside of that, I just write about how sports in different ways intersect with life in the Tri-County area. So there's high school sports, there's Winthrop, and then there's kind of just anything else, anything related to sports. And then in addition to that, I have been doing some other cool stuff with sports. As you mentioned, I helped with the Charlotte Observer, who is a sister newspaper of the Herald in Rock Hill. I assisted the Charlotte Observer with some Carolina Panthers coverage when I was available, which made for a really long work week, working on Sundays as well as Friday nights and, everything. So basically, Alex is willing to do anything when it comes to sports and writing about them. But to your point about Winthrop, I really enjoy writing about Winthrop basketball. As we talked about off air, I'm a huge basketball fan, and I really enjoy how basketball is one of the most revealing sports when it comes to learning about a player's story. I mean, there's something special about the fact that players aren't wearing a face mask. They are literally right. They're also not super far away from you. They're right there. You can honestly hear what they're saying to their teammates. You can see their personality, and you can see their personality in how they play. Like, how they play is emblematic of who they are. Like one of your favorite players, Kevin Garnett. Oh my gosh, that dude wears his heart on his sleeves, or he did when he was playing. And basketball is just it's one of those sports where you just love to be a sports writer for those people, because you're just like, man, if I can get inspired about this dude dribbling a basketball, if I can get inspired about this dude shooting a three, like, imagine what happens when I tell this dude's life story. So I really enjoy covering Winthrop, and I'm glad that you have followed that, Maliik.
Oh yeah. So speaking of, when I was listening to the most recent episode of your podcast, Shouting from the Rafters, one of the things one of the things you mentioned was how you felt like DJ Burns, you wanted him to be more showcased on a national stage. So maybe do you want to talk a little about what inspires you about him specifically, since we're on the topic?
Oh, absolutely. I'm always happy to talk about DJ Burns. So just to give some background, DJ Burns is the starting forward on the Winthrop men's basketball team. And Winthrop is a Division I basketball program in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And DJ's a starting forward for them, starting center. He is a rarity in Big South basketball, but he's also a rarity in the college basketball landscape now, in general. He's a back to the basket guy. He's big. He's lumbering. He is from Rock Hill. So that's another really impressive thing. He literally grew up going to Winthrop games, and he was he was a huge recruit coming out of high school. Roy Williams showed up at his high school gym. A whole bunch of the legendary coaches showed up to watch him play. And he ultimately decided to go to Tennessee, which was one of the best teams in the country when he committed there. He redshirted there. He ultimately decided not to continue going there, and he transferred to Winthrop. And in the cliche sports writer's realm, he came home, and I'm using air quotes, and he came home to Winthrop, and now he is dominating at Winthrop, and he's doing so in a way that is unique. It's something that community members really need to take the time to go see him play if you are a college basketball fan, because oh my goodness, this dude, he's a lefty, he plays back to the basket, he dunks, he is so efficient around the basket, he smiles a lot, he talks to the other team. I mean, this dude does not need much motivation to play, and he's just unique in all of Winthrop sports history. I mean, Winthrop is it's a mid-major school with loads of players who are known for being overlooked and undersized, and dudes who can just shoot the crap out of the ball, and people who said, okay, you're 5'10", not 6 foot, we're not going to look at you. These high major schools are like, no, we're not going to look at you. But DJ Burns is literally huge, for one, and two, he is someone who high majors wanted and coveted, and he came back to Winthrop to play, and he's playing really well. And I don't know, he's super entertaining, and I think the Rock Hill community would really enjoy seeing him play. And so when I talked about on my most recent podcast of, it would be a shame if Winthrop didn't make the NCAA tournament if for no other reason, because DJ Burns didn't get this national spotlight that he deserves. And I still agree with that. Maliik, what's your take on all of that? Do you agree? Do you remember DJ playing at York Prep Academy, which is a high school in York County, a couple years ago? Do you remember him?
I don't. He has name recognition in the area for me, but I don't remember anything about a York Prep
You're pretty young.
High School. As far as DJ Burns goes, no. But
you're pretty young during that time. That makes sense.
Yeah, and then I also just didn't really follow high school basketball. The only high school basketball that I thought about in the area before, like, just, covering sports, obviously, since that's what I want to do for a living now, was I think Zion Williamson came to play Rock Hill High once, and that's, of course, Zion Williamson is this huge name now, number 1 pick in the NBA draft. He's in the NBA now. Massive superstar, even in high school. But yeah, other than that, haven't heard much.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I guess if your frame of reference is Zion Williamson, everything else is kind of small potatoes. But,
no,
man, DJ's a big deal.
Yeah, no.
DJ's a big deal in my heart. It's my his heart.
As he should be. And since we've referenced the Shouting from the Rafters podcast, we might as well just go into that. I do want to know how you and Brian Wilmer came in touch with each other and became friends. He's a member of the U.S. Basketball Writers Association and a writer for College Hoops Digest, and he's your co-host on the Shouting from the Rafters podcast. So how did you two become friends, and can you take me and the audience behind the scenes of the creation of the Shouting from the Rafters podcast?
Absolutely. So firstly, the fact that you are putting Brian on this pedestal, firstly, I love it so much. Brian is a pretty self-deprecating dude. So once he does hear this podcast, Maliik Cooper is going to be Brian's number 1. Okay. So just be prepared for that. Number 2, how we got connected. So Brian has been in York County for a really long time. He's a talented writer. He has freelanced for the Herald for a really long time, predating me. I think he arrived at the same time my predecessor, Brett McCormick, did. But Brian has what he calls, quote unquote, a big boy job, which I take issue with because I like to think I'm an adult and I'm doing my job, but whatever. So he kind of sees sports writing as sports writing isn't his day job. That said, he's really good at it, really talented, and he takes what he does really seriously. And so I caught wind of him 2 years ago. Before I had even met him in person, I had employed him to go out to a high school football game on one of my first nights covering the stuff, or in my job, covering high school football games. And he turned in a really good story, and he was playful with his words. He was fun. It was interesting to read. And that was my relationship with him for the first few months of me being in the job. And then I realized that he covered every Winthrop basketball game through College Hoops Digest, which you just mentioned. And we were the only two who covered Winthrop regularly. And so sitting next to each other and having this bond over loving writing, and also just kind of being quirky guys who didn't take themselves super seriously in terms of, we take our work super seriously, but we also like to inject levity in everything that we do, because sports are supposed to be fun, and that's the best way to cover them, in my opinion. We just started talking, and we had really good rapport. We had really good banter. I'm not someone who considers myself super funny per se, but when talking with Brian, just like any good friend, I become kind of funny, and he's really funny. And one day Brian was like, "Hey, Alex," this was after a full season covering Winthrop together. And then in the 2020 year, in the pandemic year, when we were literally dwelling in the uppermost part of Winthrop Coliseum, and the game was being played what felt like 100 miles away, and there were no fans in the stands, Brian turned to me and he was like, "Dude, how fun would it be to have a podcast to kind of bring a voice to what we report on? Because a lot of people can't see what we're seeing, and a lot of people aren't in the gym. They're kind of just seeing stuff on ESPN Plus and whatever." And I was like, "Dude, I'm all about it. Just know that I am not trained in the audio space. I like to have fun and I like to talk to you, but I am not trained in the audio space." And he's like, "No, you'll be great." So we talk for a little bit, or we bounce around some ideas for a little bit. And then after one game, Brian's like, "You ready?" And I'm like, "Yeah." We just have the microphones, and he starts a conversation about Winthrop basketball, and we go from there. And we talk about everything. And because we go to every single game, because we are around the Winthrop program all the time, we talk to the players, we talk to the coaches, etc., we know the team pretty well. And Brian particularly knows a lot about Big South basketball because he's been around the area and he's taken an interest in Big South basketball, but also mid-major basketball across the country. And we just talked and it was really fun. It was something that we ended up kind of looking forward to doing each week. And our small following of people who are Winthrop fans started kind of commenting on it. When they would see us in the Coliseum, they'd stop us and be like, "Hey, you and Brian are really funny this week," or whatever they would say. And that's kind of how it got rolling. So long story short, and forgive me, Maliik, this is what I do. I very much go long and then have to like kind of snap into it and be like, "Yo, Alex, rein it in." But long story short, we started when there were no fans in the stands in 2020. And now we have emerged into 2021 and now 2022, where we just talk Winthrop basketball after games, and we like to have fun. We like to talk about basketball, but we like to talk about Winthrop specifically, but we also like to talk about other big issues, hot button issues surrounding college sports, college athletics, college basketball. Our most haughty discussion that we had, which actually you weighed in on, Maliik, which I kind of want to talk about, was should coaches go back to wearing suits like they were pre-pandemic, or are we cool with them wearing khakis and polos? I mean, this is the kind of groundbreaking journalism that the world needs. So I'm obviously kidding, but we talked about a whole bunch of stuff, and that was one thing that we talked about in our last podcast. But bottom line is, I'm glad. Thank you for asking me about the podcast. I love talking about it, obviously.
By a small following of Winthrop fans, you definitely mean your 30 million loyal annual listeners every time the podcast comes out.
Yes, that's one of our biggest inside jokes. We have a ton of inside jokes. Thank you, Maliik. Thank you.
I love it. You guys, listen to the Shot from the Rafters podcast. It's so good. Who came up with the name, by the way?
Oh, it's Brian. Brian did it.
He came up with the name.
Oh man, this is really a really long sponsor, a really long advertisement for Brian Wilmer, really, because Brian came up with the name. We actually had one of our good friends, Brian Dillon, make this beautiful graphic of us sitting, our Bitmojis sitting on a whole bunch of rafters. And so he helped us out with the graphics. Brian and I worked the Twitter account together, and we're trying to build that, which is actually proving to be kind of difficult, which is interesting. For as many people as listen to the podcast, it's kind of interesting that it's harder to build a Twitter fan base around it. But, that's another fun experiment that Alex and Brian are learning in this new changing world of media.
On March 25th of last year, Pat Kelsey, the former men's basketball coach at Winthrop, announced he was leaving to take the head coaching job at the College of Charleston. What was your immediate reaction to this news, and what was it like having to cover that for the Herald?
Well, my immediate reaction was, dude, I just have, for the previous 2 weeks, me and a team of reporters had poured in like 18 stories about Winthrop men's basketball leading up to their NCAA tournament game in about a week. And some of them were quite long, and it was super fun to do. But once they lost, I thought that the season was over, and I thought I could take a quick break. So I was actually back at my parents' house in Raleigh, and I was actually playing tennis with my dad. And I hear some rumblings that Pat Kelsey was leaving. And in the same time I picked up my phone, I heard someone text me like, "Yo, Pat might be leaving." And then like 10 minutes later, but in the same time I'm looking at my phone, I am reading that he's going to College of Charleston, and that reports say that he's going to College of Charleston. So my immediate reaction was like, dang, I have to write about Winthrop again? I was like, oh man, I was not truly expecting this. But at the same time, my reaction also wavered to Pat Kelsey was at the time one of the most sought after mid-major college basketball coaches in the country. a year before, he was a finalist for the Wake Forest job, which was the only school in high major college basketball to have a coaching change. And Wake Forest is obviously an ACC school, and he does have his own separate ties to Wake Forest. He used to coach there under Skip Prosser, but at the same time, that this guy was going places. I mean, the Winthrop athletic director, literally very often in our conversations, Ken Halpin at the time, in our conversations, he would say, oh yeah, every year that I've been the athletic director at Winthrop, people have told me you're going to lose Pat Kelsey. And he took that as saying, Pat Kelsey is such a good coach and he's an ambitious coach that he will one day move on from Winthrop. And he meant it in a very positive way, which it came across as a positive way. And having someone like Pat in the Winthrop program for 9 years or for a decade, I can't remember anymore, but having someone in there for so long was really awesome for Winthrop, but also his time was coming. I mean, a couple years earlier, he agreed to be the head coach at the University of Massachusetts, and there was a press conference set up and everything, and he ultimately, at the final hour, literally, he informed the Massachusetts athletic director that he was coming back to Rock Hill and coming back to Winthrop. So this guy was a hot commodity, and the fact that he had led Winthrop to such an amazing year, they went 23-2. They won the Big South again. They were a 12 seed in the NCAA tournament, which is borderline unheard of for a Big South automatic qualifier. I mean, these were terrific accomplishments, and the fact that he was ready, the combination of him being ready to go and coaches and other organizations being like, yo, we want Pat Kelsey, I was ultimately not super surprised.
So, and you also just talked about how you were in Raleigh when you were hearing about this story. You're not from Rock Hill at all. So, and you went to the University of North Carolina.
Oh, yes.
What?
Yeah, I went to you.
We accept you here. You're a part of our community, of course. But being from Raleigh, maybe when did your inspiration to become a sports writer start, like growing up in that community?
Yeah, Maliik, you just said, yeah, you're not from Rock Hill at all, man. Like, it's written all over your face, blah, blah. I was like, oh, my. Okay. All right. Thanks,
we accept you here.
Okay. Thank you. So that's a good question. I grew up in this kind of rural place in Chatham County, North Carolina, but when I was in elementary school, we moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, and writing was just something that I was always good at, interested in. I also really loved sports. I played basketball and tennis in high school, and so when it came time to people to ask me, so what do you want to do the rest of your life in 7th and 8th grade, I was like, okay, well, I want to be a journalist, because it is a practical way of applying this thing that I love, writing, and being able to see every single day your name in the newspaper and your work being accepted and read by other people. So I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. Also, when I was in 7th and 8th grade, that was 2008, 2009, whatever. That was a time when newspapers were at just absolutely raking in money. It didn't look like the news business would ever be hit with anything, with any sort of financial challenges, financial struggles. So being a newspaper reporter was like really cool. And there was a way, and there was kind of a set path in climbing said ladder and stuff. I say all that to say, I get to college, and I always loved sports, as I was saying, and I always loved writing, as I was saying, but I get to college and I joined the Daily Tar Heel newspaper, which is a student newspaper there. And I quickly realized that my love for sports alone cannot sustain me being a sports writer in the future. Like, I needed something more than that. Yeah, I needed to love to write, and I needed to love to grind, and I needed to love talking to people. And fortunately, all three of those things I did love to do. And so being at the Daily Tar Heel really nurtured my love for not just telling people stories, but sports writing specifically. And then after the Daily Tar Heel, I got a summer sports intern. I was a summer sports intern at the News and Observer, which is the local newspaper in Raleigh, North Carolina, but it covers all of the state. And then after that, in the summer of 2019, I came to Rock Hill and became the sports editor here. So I'm currently 25 years old, and I look younger than that, probably, Maliik. You're probably shocked to know that I'm 25. And this is my first job, but I've learned so much on this job. I've learned how to write. I've improved my writing. I've learned how to manage other people. I've learned how to do pretty much anything that you could think of. Manage budgets, manage time, figure out content story plans and stuff like this, stuff that I could never have really truly imagined me learning how to do in college, or even when I was a 7th or 8th grader, being like, yeah, I want to be a journalist, why not? And it's been a really fruitful experience. I'm sorry, Maliik, was that too long-winded? What do you have a follow-up onto my story? I'm not very good at telling my own life story.
That was actually perfect, because what I was going to say next is I felt the same sort of urge at that exact same time, 7th or 8th grade, around what would have been 2013, 2014 for me when I was in 8th grade. I spent my entire summer that summer. Every morning at 10 a.m., I would turn on First Take and I would see Stephen A. and I believe Skip Bayless was still on the show at the time. Absolutely go at it. And how you were talking about the newspaper was a way to see your name in the news and get recognition for your thoughts and things like that. I sort of had the same thought with the broadcast side of things. I was like, well, Stephen A. and Skip are arguing about this, but this is my opinion. This is what I want them to know about it, especially when they're having a debate and there's just a side of it that I felt like they weren't covering. And I felt, you know how people are in sports debate. I feel like I'm right, and I want you guys to know that. So that's what sort of got me into it. Obviously, I love to write just like you. I was writing basketball articles at that age with nowhere to post them, and I sort of started on the same path that you talked about. So that was really cool to hear from you.
Oh, dude, what happened to these lost articles? Once you become rich, you still got them? All right, well, once you become rich and famous, are you going to, like, I don't know, expose them for the world to see and be like, this is what I was doing at 7th grade?
The lost archives of Maliik Cooper, absolutely. I do keep them all because I want to see how I've improved over time. I'm sure you've seen an old article that you used to write and you're like, wow, I've gotten so much better since then. It's cool to see. So yeah, I do keep them now that you've said that. Just how growing up in the Raleigh area, I know you said you weren't specifically from there, but UNC, Duke, Wake Forest, having those big programs around you and then working at the Daily Tar Heel, what did having those big programs around you have, or how did they influence you as a sports writer?
Well, it was a dream come true covering games for the Daily Tar Heel. I was a born and bred Tar Heel. My mom went there for undergrad. My dad got his MBA from there. We grew up in North Carolina, so I grew up with legends like Phil Ford, Raymond Felton. I don't know why I just did it in that order, but I grew up with the 2005 national championship team of Raymond Felton, Marvin Williams, Rashad McCants, Jawad Williams. I grew up with those guys, and I saw those guys as heroes. These guys were people who could inspire me. I felt like they were part of the family because they were on in the living room every day. And being someone who is inclined to like sports, but also someone who's inclined to write and stuff, and kind of saw a path where professionally, hey, I could do this for a living. Once I came to the Daily Tar Heel and realized that I could talk to college athletes at a university that meant so much to me from so long ago, it was just it was a dream come true and only propelled my desire to be a sports writer. I will say the first time I covered a UNC, or the first and only time, full disclosure, of covering a UNC Duke basketball game in the Smith Center, that was electric. And that literally felt like, I'm getting goosebumps as I say it, that literally felt like you were realizing your dream in real time. It was a special game as well. Duke and UNC always have pretty intense battles, and this one came down to the end, and kind of a scrappier, not as talented UNC team was like ultimately surprised and beat Duke, and it ended with a Theo Pinson dunk, and that was the loudest I've ever heard the Smith Center be. And Theo Pinson, before going into the locker room, just stood on this chair, and you looked out into the sea of fans who were screaming at him, screaming his name and stuff like this. And he just like looked at them, and he was just like, after a night of giving all he had, he kind of just wanted to take everything in. And I remember turning to my partner, who was also writing at the Daily Tar Heel with me, over this crazy amount of noise. I remember grabbing him and I said, "That's my story. That's my story." And I was just like, and it was really cool. And that game it's framed, that game story and that newspaper edition is framed in my childhood room to this day. And so, yeah, when you ask about how does having big institutions, sports institutions, influence my desires and my career as a sports writer, me being at the Daily Tar Heel, it only enhanced my experience. It only made me realize, you've already accomplished your dream at 20 years old. Now go do more. Figure out a way where you can like do something beyond your dreams. And now my dreams have kind of shifted into this local journalism niche. And now I think that is how I can make the world a better place, a more loving place, a more united place. And I'm trying to channel that passion that 20-year-old Alex had, and I'm trying to put it into what I do every day, covering high school and Winthrop athletics.
How often did you get to talk to Roy Williams, if at all?
I got to talk to him. Well, okay, what does talk to mean? I mean, I wasn't like drinking a beer with him. I wasn't on the golf course with him. I attended semi-regular men's basketball press conferences. And I think in my 2 years of covering men's basketball for the newspaper, I think I might have asked like 4 questions in total. The dude was a pretty intimidating guy for being 5'8" and for being so, personable. And I personally am someone who's inspired by Roy Williams, and I can say that from an unbiased reporter now that he is retired and blah, blah, blah. But as someone who has been inspired by this guy from North Carolina, born and bred North Carolina, someone who beat odds to be where he is. Okay, I'm going to get on my soapbox about Roy if I keep going on this track. But as someone who loved this man from afar for so much, and to see him in his flesh and to actually be able to ask questions, it was a pretty intimidating task. So I did not ask a ton of questions. But soon, once you're around him enough, you start to readjust your brain. You're like, wait, this dude is a normal person who drinks Diet Coke and who, plays golf, whatever. And so I got to ask him a couple questions. But were we ever buddies? Would he know me by my first name or last name? Absolutely not.
Coming from a UNC family, what was it like when he retired?
Oh, it was heartbreaking. It was one of those moments when, so it was really funny. I'm really happy that you asked that question. So it was really funny. The university announced his retirement on April 1, 2021. And right? Yeah, April 1, 2021. And that same day, there were reports that Winthrop was having a board of trustees meeting to like have an emergency hire or whatever. And that was clear from my sourcing and my reports or whatever, that they were going to hire a head coach. And so I was like, oh my goodness, I am going to cover this new guy coming into Winthrop the same day that I am. The same day that I and the rest of my friends from college or whoever are talking about Roy Williams leaving. And it was really interesting when Mark Prosser got introduced as the Winthrop men's basketball head coach. I wrote a column basically talking about how Mark Prosser is kind of the beginning of the foundation of perhaps a Winthrop basketball family, because you hear all this talk about how Carolina cares so much about the Carolina family and being all of the same Tar Heel blue bloodline, whatever. Roy Williams was the patriarch of that family for a long time, and before him was Dean Smith, and he was the guy who kind of engineered it all. Yeah. And so, but Mark Prosser, him coming into the Winthrop program was similar to that in some ways, because he coached under Pat Kelsey, and both of them were really influenced by this one guy who never coached at Winthrop, but was really influential in the sport of college basketball, Skip Prosser. Skip Prosser was a legendary coach at Xavier and at Wake Forest. Pat Kelsey played and coached under him. And obviously Mark Prosser was the son of Skip Prosser. And so there were these interesting parallels all over the place. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to write about how Winthrop in this hire is in a way extending or creating a basketball family, or at least trying to. And then I related it to Roy retiring, and so I got to get my Carolina fix in that way. But I just think that was funny. I'm not sure that answers your question, but I thought that was interesting.
It was very interesting to know that all that happened around the time that Roy Williams retired. Do you have any thoughts on Hubert Davis?
I like him.
You like him?
To be fair, I do not. Yeah, I like him. To be fair, I do not have a ton of insight. I am purely someone who just watches the games from afar. And I talk with some people who perhaps know more sometimes, but I just enjoy the fact that he is cut from the same cloth as Roy Williams. I really love his story. Something that's really important about cultivating something like a basketball family is having an agreed upon narrative of why this institution or these people mean so much to you. And Hubert clearly shares that passion, and that's really important. And now all he's got to do is live up to these crazy high expectations that all these Carolina fans have.
Okay, moving towards the end here, one of the last things I wanted to ask was, you got your bachelor's degree upon graduating from the University of North Carolina, right? So what was life like post-college, sort of looking for work?
Well, I was blessed. I was someone who, right out of college, I interned with my local newspaper. It's a very big newspaper, but it was still technically the one that my parents and my family took. And I was the sports intern for that summer, and I wrote about a whole bunch of things. I wrote a whole bunch of features. During the summer is when a lot of the beat reporters and a lot of the people who covered Duke basketball or Duke athletics and UNC athletics and NC State athletics, as well as the Hurricanes, those are the times when they can finally take some time off and they can finally be with their families, and they don't have to spend Friday nights and Saturday nights either out of town or at a stadium. And so I had a lot of freedom to write a lot of impactful and fun stories and feature stories, long form stories that, wouldn't be overshadowed by the day-to-day grind of, Kobe White scores 26 points and win over Miami. You know what I'm saying? And so that was really fun. And then in addition, so that's what I did for the summer after my senior year of college. And then while I was working as an intern, someone approached me and said, "Hey, do you want to work at the Herald," which is also the News and Observer, the Charlotte Observer, and the Herald in Rock Hill. They're all under the same media company called McClatchy. And so they're always kind of looking for talent within to kind of fill holes, but also to, promote people and stuff like this. And they were like, "Hey, this position is open. Would you be interested in taking it?" And I was like, "Heck yeah, let's do it." And I got to fulfill my dream of being a full-time sports reporter. And then I later cultivated this future dream of me being a part of the solution of local journalism and ultimately trying to save the world through my local journalism.
Save the world. You have to go into detail now. Save the world through local journalism. Matter of fact, why is the world in danger, so to speak, to where it needs to be saved by local journalism?
Because, Maliik, the world's always needed to be saved.
Is that so?
That's a very Batman response. But the world has always needed saving. I mean, you go through any part of history and you think that the world needs saving. Personally, right now, I think that the value that local journalism brings, and I've said it 100 times on this podcast already, I'm sorry, but the value that local journalism brings is you can bring people together that otherwise would not be living in the same reality. And once you can do that, you can affect real change. You can promote real love. You can unite people. You can do some powerful things when people care about and respect and read your local newspaper. And that is what I am trying to do at the Herald. And so when you can do these powerful things, I can take the logical jump and say, yes, you can change the world and you can save the world. I sometimes say save the world to get people's attention, which I just did with you. It's probably not the most, saving the world is probably a little hyperbole, but we're having fun.
It's funny that you say that, actually, because on episode 1 of the last things me and Armand Brody talked about was this tribal mentality in the media now, where you're either on one side of the fence or the other. You either tune into CNN or Fox, basically. So what you said just now about local journalism saving the world is important to me, because if we're going to strike and start meaningful conversations, it might have to start with sports, because like you said, that's one of the only places in our country where everyone can just come under the same umbrella in a loving fashion with common support for something. So that's something for me. I personally think that journalism is important for that specific reason, because that's no way to have civil discourse, is for people to only listen to what they agree with. So I just felt like it was very important that you brought that up, and I wanted to echo your sentiments there. But that was a lot to get through, but we did it. So thanks for coming on the show with me and spending some time on the Media Conversations with Maliik Cooper podcast. Don't forget to follow Alex at Alex Zietlow 05, and Zietlow is spelled Zietlow, and support the Shouting from the Rafters podcast on Spotify, and follow its Twitter at Shout Rafters. You have anything else to say before we go?
Well, Maliik, thank you for having me on the show. For 2, I completely and wholeheartedly agree with everything that you just said. It's not just sports. I completely agree that sports is where people can truly come together, but anything, when you boil it down to a local level, you can realize that we're not that much different from each other. On a national level, on a 10,000 foot scale, you're like, oh my gosh, how is this person from this state? How is this person similar to me at all? But when you realize that you're not that different from your neighbor, you realize also that you're not that different from someone who lives at a neighboring state. And when you realize that you're not that different from someone who lives in a neighboring state, you're not that different from anyone in America. And once you realize you're not that different from anyone in America, well, guess what, bro? All humans can find a common ground. And obviously there's nuance in that. Obviously everyone has different stories, and that's the point of local journalism. But anyway, I really appreciate what you're doing with this, Maliik. You have a bright future ahead of you, and I hope that you continue to channel your passion for local journalism and keep bringing cool stuff to light like this. And thank you for letting me blabber on the show. It was a ton of fun.